So now we come to the U.S. population. We ask ourselves, what has happened to the U.S. population that they have not only have no idea, but they're not spiritually, they're not oriented towards actually reviving FDR. They're not oriented towards going back to John F. Kennedy. They're not oriented towards reviving the nation, even though the opportunity now exists for reviving the nation. So tonight I'm going to concentrate on one of the key factors that has caused this problem. This key factor is called the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which has been the principal tool of control of the United States population increasingly since 1944. And it's the FBI, directed by the British, directed by Wall Street, which has enforced the circumstances which have led not only to the population becoming total cowards, fearful, and small, but it's this agency which has essentially played this key role on behalf of the British and on behalf of Wall Street. So I'll start with 1944, because that's the turning point. That's when the coup actually took place against Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was running for a fourth term, but everyone knew that he was very ill and was not expected to live much further on. And it was known that the Nazis would be defeated. Actually, the Nazis were primarily defeated by the Soviet Union. And the Wall Street crowd and the British crowd were absolutely determined that Roosevelt's chosen successor, Henry Wallace, would not be allowed to become vice president. And they did everything to prevent Henry Wallace from becoming vice president. Now, who was Henry Wallace? Henry Wallace, for 8 years prior to 1940, was considered the most competent administrator in the Roosevelt administration. He was the head of the Department of Agriculture. He was the Secretary of Agriculture. He was also an agricultural scientist. He was also a person that FDR considered to be a thinker. Somebody FDR considered to be a thinker. And FDR, going into World War II in 1940, at the 1940 convention, was determined that Wallace would be his vice presidential candidate and vice president during the war. The hardcore Wall Street crowd in the Democratic Party and the Southern racists in the Democratic Party did everything possible to prevent him from becoming the vice presidential nominee in 1940. And it reached such a crisis that Franklin Delano Roosevelt told the party that he would not accept the nomination for president if they did not agree to Wallace being the vice presidential. That's how serious it was. Now, during the war, Wallace was also the #1 administrator of the war economy. As vice president, he was also put in charge of the war economy. And he was somebody who was very familiar with Alexander Hamilton and was always recommending that Hamilton be read, that America's economics comes from Hamilton. And his response to Henry Luce of Time, which called for the post-war American imperial century, was no. It must be the century of the common man. And while he was very popular, there was an absolute revolt going on in the Democratic Party against his nomination within those layers. And FDR was weak. He was sick. And he was not able to prevent this. He was not able to hold on. And that was the coup. That was the turning point in U.S. history, 1944. With Truman as the vice presidential running mate, the subsequent death of FDR, and Truman becoming president, everything was rapidly reversed. All of FDR's people were thrown out. Wallace, the head of the intelligence, William Donovan. The British Embassy, which had over 1,000 employees, worked very closely with the Truman administration. So in effect, you had a British-American administration which went against the policies of FDR, revived colonialism, protected the Nazis, launched the anti-communist, anti-Soviet, dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All of that was done to generate a Cold War. But in this, there was an absolute witch hunt being directed against the FDR crowd. And this was something of an inquisition. And the FBI emerged as the agency that directed the Inquisition. And throughout the 40s, this Inquisition was growing. And what the FBI did is through the House Un-American activities, they started this very high-profile campaign of subpoenaing thousands of people to confront them with whether or not they had ever been or a communist now, or have ever been a communist. And so that began the witch hunt against communists. And then the trials of the Rosenbergs was another example of this, and other high-profile cases. But it was the FBI who was providing all of the anonymous information to the House Un-American Activities Committee. And it was also, and then off of that came McCarthy and Richard Nixon, who ran these operations. And it reached this peak, this anti-communist peak reached in 1954 with the accusations of communism in the armies. But it was very clear that this was the cover for then the actual operations that the FBI was running in the trade unions, was running on the campuses, was running in the corporations, was running against government officials. That part you didn't see. One example was my father, Paul Glumaz, who in 1950 was a leading member of the Longshoremen's Union on the West Coast. He was also in the Communist Party. By then, the Communist Party had been infiltrated and taken over by the FBI. And what they did is they snitch-jacketed my father, meaning that they, FBI operatives in the running the Communist Party, accused my father of being an FBI operative. He lost all his friends. Nobody would talk to him. Nobody would trust him after that. And then, after that situation occurred, the FBI approached my father and said, "Okay, we can make life easier for you. Here's some help. We want you to testify to the effect that the leader of the Longshoremen's Union at the time, Harry Bridges, was a communist. Because at that time, the law was about to be passed called the McCarran Act, which would allow them to deport foreigners who they had evidence were communists. And this is the case of they wanted to do this to Harry Bridges. They were going after the Longshoremen's Union. Because the Longshoremen's Union was not a union that was willing to bow down. Other unions were willing to bow down, but the Longshoremen's Union was not a union that was willing to bow down, so they wanted to break the leadership. Well, my father didn't go along with that, but because of the situation, he had no friends, he had nothing, his life was ruined, he left the country. And that was typical. Operations were run against individuals, professors at major campuses like the University of Washington. They would find a scandal. They would politicians, and this is the kind of thing that was occurring at an expanded basis, to the point that people were afraid to talk in public. People were afraid to discuss ideas. Somebody might think that you might be a communist. You might be reported on. intellectuality was suspect. You know, anybody who was an intellectual was suspect. And so this environment just began to take control of the United States. And later on, it wasn't so much communism as it was just outright suppression of people, breaking them, making them crawl. And as this was going on, you began to have a stratification of American society. A kind of a caste system was evolving, centered around the fact that if you wanted a good job in the defense industry or in the government, or even not a good job, you had to go through the FBI. They had to find out if you were a communist, or if you knew any communists, or if you were the right kind of political animal or whatever. And so people lived in this kind of emerging fear. And so those people who were willing to submit themselves to this and were approved were the ones who got the better jobs. And those who didn't get the better jobs. And then this spread to other, it's kind of spread to all the other areas, the trade unions, the corporations, and most of all the media. And there was this very high profile thing with the Hollywood 10, but hundreds and hundreds of top Hollywood people were subpoenaed, and the better artists, the more intelligent, the more articulate, the more intellectual of the Hollywood artists were crushed. And so the idea that was being run was, we're not going to have any more FDR. We're not going to have any more FDR policies. We're not going to go back to FDR. Nobody's going to run from now on an FDR policy. And so this is essentially what was done. Now, so what you had is a situation where people got promoted because they went along. They got promoted because they capitulated to the FBI. And so you had this kind of personality. One of those people who was heavily promoted was John Wayne, because he was very, he was the image of the American anti-communist. Now, the problem is that, but you had to declare that you were an anti-communist, in effect. And in the middle of all this, you had the Cold War, you had the whole hardening of relations with Russia, with the Soviet Union. You had the British playing both sides. They were helping foment this confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, and and everything began to be defined this way. So essentially, everything we did in propping up the colonial system and protecting the Nazis after World War II, the ones that didn't get tried in Nuremberg, everything from that in Vietnam was all done on the basis of stopping communism. That was all it was, is stopping communism up to that point. And people no longer had a sense in this hysteria that they were Americans. What is it to be Americans? Well, you discuss things. This person might be a communist, this person might be a right-winger, this person might be this, that person might be that. You'd have a discussion. You operate in a lawful and legal way. But that ended. And so what you had in this hysteria is that people no longer were Americans. They were anti-communists. To be an American meant you had to be an anti-communist. Now, most people had no idea what communism was, so it was a very vague thing, and there was a certain amount of hysteria around it, and it's somewhat irrational, because these people don't know what it is. It's a label. It's a projection of fear and hysteria, and this is very debilitating. This was very debilitating over a long period of time to the U.S. population. So now you're coming into the period of Kennedy, and Kennedy tries to revive and he gets assassinated, and Bobby Kennedy gets assassinated, and King gets assassinated. So you have essentially no president has been able to really run on reviving FDR since 1944. And what's the situation now? We have to revive the policies of FDR if we're going to survive as a nation. Now, it's estimated that there are 15,000 registered informants, and probably 3 to 4 times that number if you count sources and non-registered informants. So you have 45,000 to 60,000 people collaborating with the FBI in the United States. And that's the averages out to 500 to 700, one FBI collaborator per 500 to 700 Americans. Now, what are all these people doing? A lot of them are in the media. So one of the things is that all the slanders that people get, most of them politicians get, are funneled through the FBI. The FBI maintains these files, these covert files, these large files, and then they say, so the key thing here is that if you're politically active and you're independent, the FBI will start to run operations against you. First, they'll go to your family, or they'll plant rumors around you. They'll try to create the environment that you're strange, you're weird, whatever. You're not going with the program. They start to attack you. The two congressional groups that were most attacked in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s were labor-connected congressmen. The most notable one was Senator Harrison Williams from New Jersey. He was framed up very clearly, and through sting operations and bribe operations, through something called Abscam Brilab, which involved 1,200 investigations and 3,000 FBI agents. And this is the thing that cleaned out the opposition to the deregulation of the financial system. You wouldn't have had all these financial problems if they hadn't cleaned out the elected officials that were opposing the deregulation of the financial system. And that's how they did it. The other group was instinctively not with the program, and that's your African American elected officials who represented a constituency that did not have sympathy for Wall Street or for the British. And every black politician was essentially targeted under an operation that was discovered later in the 80s called Operation Frühmenschen, which is German for primitive man. And the basis for the operations was that blacks were not fit to run a country. They weren't fit to be trusted morally. They were immoral. And almost every black elected official was targeted. Al Gore cut his teeth working with the FBI and framing up and slandering Nashville, Tennessee black politicians. That's how Al Gore got his start. So they also recruited young prospects, political prospects, at an early age and helped them up through the ladder. So you have this caste system emerging. Also, organized crime. Organized crime was expected to share their intelligence with the FBI. Those elements of organized crime which shared their intelligence with the FBI, of course, tended to do better. They tended to get more protection from the FBI. So you have this vast network of control. And then, but it's blackmail where the real power was, because an FBI agent would show up at a congressman's office and say, the Bureau wants you to know that, we think very highly of your service to your country, with the implication being that the Bureau is watching you and we're expecting you to follow, the policies. And it got really bad by the 70s. Cornelius Gallagher was a congressman, a close friend of Kennedy, a congressman from New Jersey. He had this war with the FBI. They ended up putting him in jail. And on our website, the LaRouche PAC website, there's an incredible 3-hour, 2.5-hour interview with Cornelius Wallace. It gets you the best sense of it, of any thing that I can give you. So the insidiousness of this is very important to understand, because the way it works is not so much to frame people up, except at the level when they get to be a problem, or to assassinate people when they get to be a problem, but rather to poison the atmosphere, to 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 ridicule or demean intellectuality, to ridicule and demean people that have altruistic motives, that want to do good. It's that kind of environment. It's that kind of, well, why are you doing that? Shouldn't you be looking out for your family? Shouldn't you be worrying about your career? Why do you want to do that? Kind of thing. So it's that kind of environment that is seeping through the society. And what's happened over time is the population has been broken. Our best presidents, our best people have been killed. And the FBI is at the center of all of this, as the agency of the British and and Wall Street, the British Empire and Wall Street. That's what they are. And this is what happened to America, and it's still happening to America. Although it's true. And the issue of surveillance is not about they're watching you. No, it's blackmail. It's all about blackmail. It's about control through blackmail. That's what the issue is. Or planning false stories, planning false rumors. All of this is being done. Targeting organizations. And slander. Einstein was horribly slandered. In fact, the FBI tried to prevent Einstein from immigrating to the United States. The British were hoping that the Nazis would kill Einstein. They didn't want him immigrating. Martin Luther King was horribly slandered. Lyndon LaRouche. The FBI was planning slanders everywhere. He's a racist. He's an anti-Semite. He's a right-winger. He's a communist. He's a cult leader. He's a crackpot. He's a CIA man. He's an agent of the Vatican, etc., depending upon the audience. And they would plant these things. And they would say, we can't tell you why, but we can tell you that, yes, he is what we're telling you. Why can't you tell us why? Where's the evidence? Well, we can't tell you the evidence. We don't want to compromise our informants. And this is how it works. And then they provide these dossiers to people, on people. They go behind your back. And this is the FBI. This is how they operate. This is how the political system has been controlled in the United States increasingly since 1944. But now we're in a situation where the power that runs this FBI is collapsing. The FBI will not know necessarily what to do. Either the power is going. And the problem is the population has been so conditioned to a littleness, a fear of being an intellectual, a fear of thinking. You know, it's more important that you say the right thing in the right place than saying something that goes against what people are saying, or might be a criticism. Or it might be an idea. It might be an idea that's better than what these people are, and it might be a concept. And it's this environment that you have to go along to get along, that you have to regiment yourself, that you have to castrate your mind, that you have to essentially not show your intelligence, not show your mind. And then when you do, you get attacked. That's the FBI. That's the system that we were living. We didn't used to live in that kind of system before. Before 1944, or even, we didn't have that kind of system. You didn't have a social system like that. In fact, there was a book written in '56 called The Organizational Man by William White. And that book documents how in that decade, corporate executives had shifted from being much more creative, much more outspoken, much more innovative, to being very conformist. And that coheres with the period we're talking about. That social, the people wouldn't speak out. When you do speak out, people are upset. Why are they upset? because of what you're saying? No, because you're breaking the the code, the implicit sense, the fear, the social fear. You're being like that. So essentially, this is what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with the effects of 70 some years of FBI operations that have essentially been run on behalf of Wall Street, been run on behalf of the British Empire, and now that that empire and Wall Street are going down, will the American people and their leaders continue to behave as the smallest minded people you can imagine? Or is there anybody with a vision? Is there anybody who's going to come forward and actually revive the vision that FDR is, which is vitally necessary now, because we have outside the United States the nations that are now prepared to work with the United States on this: Russia, China, and India. And that's the issue. So the issue is subjective. It's not objective. We're not living in a world where the powers that be are all powerful. They're coming down. But we live in a world where the subjective sense that people have is so small, it's so petty, that they're not able to function. They're not able to dream. They're not able to have a vision. Led not only to the population becoming total cowards, fearful, and small, but it's this agency which has essentially played this key role on behalf of the British and on behalf of Wall Street. So I'll start it with 1944, because that's the turning point. That's when the coup actually took place against Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was running for a fourth term, but everyone knew that he was very ill and was not expected to live much further on. And it was known that the Nazis would be defeated. Actually, the Nazis were primarily defeated by the Soviet Union. And the Wall Street crowd and the British crowd were absolutely determined that Roosevelt's chosen successor, Henry Wallace, would not be allowed to become vice president. And they did everything to prevent Henry Wallace from becoming vice president. Now, who was Henry Wallace? Henry Wallace, for 8 years prior to 1940, was considered the most competent administrator in the Roosevelt administration. He was the head of the Department of Agriculture. He was the second, going back to John F. Kennedy. They're not oriented towards reviving the nation, even though the opportunity now exists for reviving the nation. So tonight I'm going to concentrate on one of the key factors that has caused this problem. This key factor is called the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which has been the principal tool of control of the United States population increasingly since 1944. And it's the FBI, directed by the British, directed by Wall Street, which has enforced the circumstances which have So now we come to the U.S. population. We ask ourselves, what has happened to the U.S. population that they have not only have no idea, but they're not spiritually, they're not oriented towards actually reviving FDR. They're not oriented towards Secretary of Agriculture. He was also an agricultural scientist. He was also a person that FDR considered to be a thinker. Somebody FDR considered to be a thinker. And FDR, going into World War II in 1940, at the 1940 convention, was determined that Wallace would be his vice presidential candidate and vice president during the war. The hardcore Wall Street crowd in the Democratic Party and the Southern racists in the Democratic Party did everything possible to